Have you ever made a decision so devastating that it haunted every single day of your life afterward? A choice so final that it severed the most precious bond you'd ever known? I have. And the weight of that moment has crushed my soul for more years than I care to count. My name doesn't matter anymore, not really, because the person I was before that fateful day died along with the relationship I destroyed. What matters is what I'm about to share with you. A confession that has burned inside my chest like hot coals, searing my heart with every breath I've taken since the moment I looked into my daughter's tear-streaked face and told her she had to choose between the man she loved and her own family. I never imagined those words would be the last real conversation we'd ever have, that my stubborn pride and narrow-minded judgment would cost me not just my daughter, but an entire lifetime of memories, laughter, and love that I can never get back. The day I stood at her graveside and saw him there, weeping with a raw, guttural pain that only a man who has lost his entire world can express, holding the hand of a little boy who had my daughter's eyes and her gentle smile, was the day my heart shattered into so many pieces that I don't think it will ever be whole again. That child, my grandson, a beautiful soul I never knew existed, stood there in his small black suit, looking up at the man beside him with complete trust and love, and I realized in that moment the magnitude of what my pride had stolen from me. This isn't just a story about loss, it's a story about the devastating consequences of prejudice, the unforgiving nature of time, and the unbearable weight of regret that comes when you realize you've thrown away something irreplaceable because you were too blind and stubborn to see what truly mattered. I need to take you back to understand how everything fell apart, back to a time when my daughter Sarah was still alive, still laughing with that infectious joy that could light up an entire room, still calling me Dad with that special tenderness that made me feel like the most important person in her world. She was my only child, the center of my universe after her mother passed away from cancer when Sarah was just 16. For years, it had been just the two of us against the world, navigating grief together, building a bond that I foolishly believed was unbreakable. I worked long hours as an attorney to give her everything she deserved, paid for her college education at a prestigious university, attended every important moment in her life with pride swelling in my chest. Sarah was brilliant, compassionate, and determined, everything a father could hope for in a daughter. She graduated with honors, landed a position at a non-profit organization working with underprivileged communities, and devoted her life to making a real difference in the world. I was so proud of her, so grateful that despite losing her mother, she had grown into such an incredible woman. But then, when she was 27, she came to me with news that would set in motion the greatest tragedy of both our lives. I remember that Sunday afternoon so vividly it feels like yesterday, the way the autumn sunlight filtered through the windows of my study, the nervous energy radiating from her as she sat across from my desk, fidgeting with her hands in a way she hadn't done since she was a child. She told me she had met someone, that she was in love, and that she wanted me to meet him. I smiled, feeling genuine happiness for her, already imagining the kind of man who would be worthy of my remarkable daughter, probably another professional, someone educated and ambitious who could match her intelligence and drive. But then she said his name, Miguel, and explained that he was from Mexico, that he had come to the United States as an undocumented immigrant when he was just 15, fleeing violence and poverty, searching for the dream of a better life that so many people risk everything to find. She told me he worked in construction, that he was hardworking and honest, that he had taught himself English and was taking night classes to eventually become a citizen, that he volunteered at the same community center where they had met, helping other immigrants navigate the complex and often cruel immigration system. The pride in her voice as she described him, the light in her eyes when she spoke his name, should have been enough for me to understand that this was real, that this was the kind of love that comes along once in a lifetime. But instead of seeing the man she described, the person she had fallen in love with, I only saw the labels, the circumstances, the things that didn't fit into the narrow worldview I had constructed for what my daughter's life should look like. The words that came out of my mouth next are words I have replayed in my mind thousands of times, each repetition a fresh stab of pain and remorse. I told her no, absolutely not, that I hadn't worked my entire life and sacrificed everything to give her opportunities just so she could throw it all away on some illegal immigrant who would drag her down and ruin her future. I can still see the way her face crumbled, the way the light died in her eyes as she processed what her own father was saying to her, the betrayal and hurt written across every feature. She tried to reason with me, her voice breaking as she explained that Miguel was a good man, that his immigration status didn't define his character or his worth as a human being, that she loved him with every fiber of her being and couldn't imagine her life without him. She begged me to just meet him, to give him a chance to see what she saw in him, but I was too consumed by my own prejudices, too wrapped up in my fears about what people would think, too convinced that I knew what was best for her life better than she did. I raised my voice, something I had rarely done with her, and told her that if she continued this relationship, if she chose him over common sense and her own family, then she would no longer be welcome in my home or my life. I gave her an ultimatum that no parent should ever give their child. Choose him or choose me, but you can't have both. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with shock and grief, and the shattering of everything we had built together. Sarah stood up slowly, tears streaming down her face, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of heartbreak and steely determination. She told me she was sorry I felt that way, that she had hoped I would be happy for her, that she loved me, but she couldn't and wouldn't abandon the man she was going to marry. She said she hoped one day I would change my mind and realize what I was throwing away, but until then she would respect my wishes and stay out of my life. Then she walked out of my study, out of my house, and except for a few brief, painful attempts at reconciliation that I stubbornly rejected, out of my life entirely. The years that followed were a special kind of torture, a self-imposed exile from the person I loved most in the world, a daily punishment that I endured because my pride wouldn't allow me to admit I had been wrong. I heard things through mutual acquaintances, little fragments of information about Sarah's life that both comforted and tormented me. I learned that she had married Miguel in a small ceremony that I wasn't invited to, that they had bought a modest house in a working-class neighborhood, that she continued her work at the nonprofit while he worked his way up from general laborer to foreman at a construction company. Part of me wanted to reach out, to swallow my pride and tell her I was sorry, that I had been a fool and I missed her desperately. But another part of me, the stubborn, judgmental part that had caused this mess in the first place, kept insisting that I had been right, that she had made her choice and now had to live with the consequences. I convinced myself that she would eventually come back, that her marriage would fail or she would realize she had made a mistake, and then we could repair what had been broken. I actually believed that, sitting alone in my big empty house night after night, that somehow time would prove me right and bring my daughter back to me on my terms. What a fool I was. What an arrogant, blind fool, thinking that I could control her life and that love would somehow bend to my will. I threw myself into my work, taking on more cases, working longer hours, anything to avoid the crushing loneliness and the growing realization that I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I attended social functions alone, made excuses when colleagues asked about my daughter, built walls around my heart so thick that I couldn't feel the full weight of what I had lost. Christmas came and went without her, then her birthday, then the anniversary of her mother's death, all the days that we used to spend together now marked by absence and regret. I would drive past her neighborhood sometimes like a ghost haunting the life I had rejected, hoping to catch a glimpse of her but never having the courage to stop and knock on her door. Then came the call that shattered what was left of my world, the phone ringing in the middle of the night with the kind of insistence that immediately tells you something terrible has happened. It was a police officer, his voice professional but gentle, telling me that my daughter had been in a car accident, that a drunk driver had run a red light and hit her vehicle broadside, that she had been rushed to the hospital but had not survived her injuries. The words didn't make sense at first, my brain refusing to process the information, rejecting the reality that Sarah, my vibrant, compassionate, beautiful daughter, was gone. I remember dropping the phone, the sound of it clattering on the floor seeming impossibly loud in the sudden vacuum of my life. I stood there in my bedroom, surrounded by the trappings of my successful but empty life, and felt something inside me break so completely that I knew it could never be fixed. My daughter was dead, and the last real conversation we had was the one where I had rejected her and the man she loved, where I had chosen my pride over her happiness, where I had thrown away years that I could have spent being part of her life. The guilt crashed over me like a tidal wave, crushing, suffocating, absolute. I had thought I had time, that eventually we would find our way back to each other, but time had run out and I was left with nothing but regret and the unbearable knowledge that I had wasted the precious years I could have had with her. I dressed mechanically, drove to the hospital in a daze, confirmed her identity with a numbness that felt like dying, and began the terrible process of arranging her funeral. Through it all, I wondered if Miguel knew, if he was somewhere dealing with his own devastating grief, if there was anyone else who needed to be notified. But I was so disconnected from her life that I didn't even know how to reach him, didn't know where he worked or if there was anyone else in her life who should be told that she was gone. The day of the funeral arrived shrouded in gray clouds that seemed fitting for the occasion, the sky itself mourning the loss of someone who had brought so much light into the world. I had arranged everything at the church where Sarah had been baptized, where her mother's funeral had been held, trying to honor her memory even though I had failed to honor her life. I stood at the front of the church greeting the surprisingly large crowd of people who had come to pay their respects. Colleagues from her nonprofit work, friends from college, neighbors, people whose lives she had touched with her kindness and dedication. Each person who came through the line had a story about Sarah, about something she had done for them, or the way she had made them feel valued and seen. I listened to these stories with a growing sense of despair, realizing how much of her life I had missed, how many moments and accomplishments and kindnesses I knew nothing about because I had chosen to exile myself from her world. The service was beautiful and heartbreaking, filled with tears and laughter as people shared memories of her generosity, her infectious laugh, her unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. I gave a eulogy that felt hollow and inadequate, talking about the daughter I had known before our falling out, trying to express love and pride while choking on the guilt of knowing I had abandoned her when she needed me to simply accept and support her choices. After the service, we drove in a long procession to the cemetery, and I watched as they lowered her casket into the ground next to her mother's grave, thinking about how they were together again while I was left alone with my regrets. People offered their condolences, their sympathy, their assurances that Sarah had known I loved her, but their words felt empty because I wasn't sure if that was true, if she had died, knowing that despite everything, her father had never stopped loving her. After the burial, most of the crowd dispersed, heading back to their cars and their lives, leaving me standing alone at her graveside, staring at the fresh earth and the flowers people had left, trying to comprehend the finality of it all. But then I noticed two figures approaching from the parking area, walking slowly toward Sarah's grave with a hesitance that suggested they had waited for the crowd to leave. As they got closer, I recognized the man from a photograph Sarah had shown me years ago during that terrible argument, Miguel, though he looked older now, worn down by grief and labor and life. He was holding the hand of a small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, dressed in a suit that was slightly too big for him, his dark hair neatly combed, his face bearing an expression of confusion and sadness that no child should have to wear. They stopped a respectful distance away, and I saw Miguel notice me, saw the recognition flash in his eyes followed by uncertainty about whether he should approach or leave. But the little boy, innocent and unaware of the complicated history between the adults, tugged his father's hand and pointed at the grave, asking in a small, trembling voice if that was where his mama was now. The sound of that word, mama, hit me like a physical blow, because it meant exactly what I had suddenly realized with crystal clarity. This child was Sarah's son, my grandson, a grandchild I never knew existed because I had cut myself off so completely from her life. Miguel knelt down beside the boy, and I watched as he tried to explain death to a child who was too young to fully understand why his mother wasn't coming home anymore, his voice breaking as he struggled to maintain composure for his son's sake. Then Miguel did something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. He began to weep, not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of such profound loss that it was painful to witness. He pulled the boy into his arms and cried into his son's shoulder, his whole body shaking with the force of his grief. And the boy, not fully understanding but sensing his father's pain, wrapped his small arms around Miguel's neck and held on tight, trying to comfort the one person he had left in the world. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, watching this man I had rejected and judged pour out his anguish at the grave of the woman he had loved, watching my grandson witness the destruction of his world, and feeling the full crushing weight of what my prejudice and pride had cost not just me but all of us. This was the man I had deemed unworthy of my daughter, the man I had insisted would ruin her life, and yet here he was, devastated by her loss, holding their son with a tenderness and love that spoke volumes about the kind of father and husband he had been. I thought about all the moments I had missed, the pregnancy I never knew about, the birth of my grandson, his first steps and first words, birthday parties and bedtime stories, all the precious mundane moments that make up a life and a family. I had a grandson, a beautiful little boy who carried my daughter's features and expressions, and I had never held him, never even known his name. The realization of what I had thrown away, what I had denied myself through my own narrow-minded stupidity, was almost too much to bear. I wanted to approach them, to introduce myself, to apologize for everything, and beg for a chance to be part of this child's life, but shame and guilt kept me rooted in place. What right did I have to insert myself into their grief, into their lives after I had rejected them so completely? What could I possibly say that would make up for years of absence and judgment? So I stood there like a coward, watching from a distance as Miguel finally composed himself enough to stand, taking his son's hand and leading him closer to the grave. The boy placed a small drawing on top of the flowers, a child's crayon picture of 3 stick figures holding hands with the words, "I love you, Mama," written in unsteady letters across the top. Miguel placed his hand on the headstone, his lips moving in what I assumed was a prayer or a final goodbye, and then he kissed his fingertips and pressed them to Sarah's name carved in granite. The intimacy of that gesture, the love and loss conveyed in that simple act, broke something inside me that had been barely holding together. As they turned to leave, the little boy looked directly at me for the first time, his eyes so much like Sarah's that it took my breath away, studying me with a child's uncomplicated curiosity. He asked Miguel something I couldn't hear, and I saw Miguel's face tighten, saw him glance at me with an expression I couldn't quite read before he shook his head and guided his son away. I wanted to call out, to stop them, to say something, anything, but my voice wouldn't work and my feet remained planted on the ground as I watched them walk back to an old pickup truck in the parking lot. Miguel lifted the boy into the passenger seat, buckled him in with careful attention, and then paused before getting in himself, looking back at me one more time across the cemetery. In that moment our eyes met, and I saw in his face not anger or hatred, but a deep sadness and something that might have been pity. Then he got in the truck and drove away, taking with him my grandson and any chance I might have had to tell them how sorry I was, how much I regretted everything, how desperately I wished I could turn back time and make different choices. I stood at Sarah's grave long after they left, long after the sun began to set and the cemetery workers started giving me pointed looks, trying to reconcile the man I had judged and dismissed with the devoted father and grieving husband I had just witnessed. Every prejudice I had held, every assumption I had made about Miguel based on his immigration status and his job, crumbled in the face of the undeniable truth that he had loved my daughter completely and was raising their son with a dedication and tenderness that I had no right to question. I had been so wrong about everything, so catastrophically wrong that I had destroyed relationships that should have been the foundation of my life, and now I was paying the price for that terrible judgment in the loneliest, most painful way possible. Have you ever had to confront the reality that everything you believed was right was actually wrong, that your principles and values were really just prejudices dressed up in prettier language? That confrontation is brutal and humbling, especially when it comes too late to fix the damage you've caused. The weeks following Sarah's funeral were the darkest of my life, darker even than the period after my wife died, because this loss was compounded by guilt and the knowledge that I had brought it upon myself. I couldn't sleep without seeing Miguel's grief-stricken face or my grandson's confused eyes. I couldn't eat without thinking about family dinners I had missed, birthdays uncelebrated, holidays spent apart because of my stubbornness. I tried to throw myself back into work, but I couldn't concentrate, couldn't summon the energy or interest to care about cases and clients and the legal minutiae that had once consumed my attention. My colleagues noticed the change, suggested I take time off, recommended grief counseling. But how could I explain that I wasn't just grieving my daughter's death? I was grieving the relationship I had killed years before her actual death, grieving the grandson I had never met and might never know. I started having panic attacks, waking in the middle of the night gasping for air, feeling like the walls were closing in, tormented by the thought that my grandson might grow up never knowing he had a grandfather who desperately wanted to be part of his life. I imagined him asking about his mother's family someday, and Miguel having to explain that Sarah's father had rejected them, had considered them beneath him, had chosen pride over love. What would that little boy think of me? Would he hate me? Would he understand that I had been wrong, terribly wrong? Or would he simply accept that his grandfather hadn't wanted him? The thought of my grandson believing I didn't love him, didn't want to know him, was unbearable. But equally unbearable was the question of whether I had any right to disrupt their lives now, to impose myself on their grief and their healing, when I had made it clear years ago that they weren't welcome in my life. I hired a private investigator to find out where Miguel lived, what I could learn about my grandson without actually intruding on their lives, telling myself I just wanted to know they were okay, that I wasn't planning to do anything with the information. The investigator's report painted a picture that both warmed my heart and deepened my shame. Miguel was exactly who Sarah had said he was all those years ago, a hard-working, honest man who had built a good life for his family through determination and sacrifice. He had become a citizen 2 years after they married, had worked his way up to a senior position at a reputable construction company, owned a modest but well-maintained home in a safe neighborhood with good schools. The report included information about my grandson, whose name was Daniel, Danny to his friends and family, a bright, friendly child who excelled in kindergarten, played soccer, and according to his teachers, had his mother's compassionate nature and natural leadership abilities. There were surveillance photos that the investigator had taken, images of Miguel picking Danny up from school, of them at the grocery store, at the park, going about their normal daily life. In every photo I could see the bond between them, the way Danny looked at his father with complete trust and love, the way Miguel's hand always seemed to be protectively on his son's shoulder or head, the physical manifestation of a father's constant care and attention. I stared at those photos for hours, memorizing every detail of my grandson's face, the way he smiled, the clothes he wore, trying to know him through these stolen glimpses of his life. But I also felt like a creeper, a voyeur intruding on their privacy because I was too cowardly to actually approach them and face the consequences of my past actions. What was I doing? What did I hope to accomplish by having them watched and photographed? The truth was, I didn't know. I was paralyzed by fear and guilt, wanting desperately to be part of Danny's life but terrified that my presence would only cause more pain, that Miguel would rightfully tell me to stay away, that I would be rejected the way I had rejected them. Months passed in this terrible limbo, with me existing rather than living, going through the motions of daily life while being consumed by longing and regret. I attended grief support groups but couldn't bring myself to share the full truth of my situation, couldn't admit to these strangers that I had a grandson I'd never met because of my own bigotry. I saw a therapist who helped me begin to unpack the prejudices I had absorbed from my upbringing, the unconscious biases that had seemed like logical concerns, but were really just discrimination dressed up as protectiveness. I learned about how fear and ignorance can masquerade as wisdom, how we often justify our worst impulses by telling ourselves we're acting in someone else's best interest. I read books about immigration, about the desperate circumstances that drive people to leave everything they know and risk everything for a chance at a better life. And I felt crushing shame at how I had reduced Miguel to a stereotype, rather than seeing him as a human being with his own story of courage and perseverance. I thought about what it must have taken for him to leave his home as a teenager, to cross borders and barriers, to build a life in a country that often treated people like him as less than human, and I realized that he possessed a strength and determination that I had never been tested with in my comfortable, privileged life. Sarah had seen that strength, had recognized his character and his worth, when I had been too blind and prejudiced to look beyond the surface. She had been right about him, right about their love, right about everything, and I had been catastrophically wrong. If you've been following along with this story, and you've ever struggled with your own prejudices or made judgments about people based on superficial things rather than their character, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. How did you recognize your bias, and were you able to change? Eventually, I decided I couldn't continue living in this state of paralysis and regret without at least trying to reach out, to apologize and see if there was any possibility of building some kind of relationship with my grandson. The worst that could happen was that Miguel would tell me no, would refuse to let me into Danny's life, and I would be no worse off than I already was. But if there was even a small chance that I could be part of my grandson's life, that I could try to make up for some of what I had done, then I had to take it, no matter how terrifying the prospect was. I wrote letter after letter trying to find the right words to express the depth of my remorse and my desire to make amends, but nothing seemed adequate. How do you apologize for years of prejudice and rejection? How do you explain to someone that you finally understand you were wrong, that you see them now as the person they are, rather than the stereotype you projected onto them? I threw away draft after draft, each attempt feeling more hollow and insufficient than the last. Finally, I decided that no letter could truly convey what I needed to say, that this required facing Miguel in person, looking him in the eye, and accepting whatever judgment or rejection he chose to give me. I drove to his house on a Saturday afternoon, when I knew from the investigators' reports that they would be home, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack before I even made it to the door. The house was exactly as it had appeared in the photos, a small but well-kept single-story home with a neatly trimmed lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway where a child-sized ball sat waiting to be played with. Through the front window, I could see Miguel sitting on the couch reading something while Danny played with toys on the floor nearby, a scene of domestic normalcy that I had excluded myself from through my own choices. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes trying to gather the courage to actually knock on the door, running through what I would say, imagining every possible response from anger to rejection to, in my most optimistic moments, a tentative willingness to talk. When I finally forced myself out of the car and walked up to the front door, each step felt like I was walking to my own judgment, which, in a way, I was. I rang the doorbell and heard footsteps approaching. Then the door opened and Miguel stood there, surprise and recognition flashing across his face, followed by a guardedness that was completely understandable. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I saw him more clearly than I ever had before, not as the threat to my daughter's future that I had imagined, but as a man who had loved her deeply and was now raising their son alone, carrying grief and responsibility with a quiet dignity. He was handsome in a weathered way, with kind eyes that held pain but not bitterness, and I could see why Sarah had fallen in love with him, could see the goodness and strength that radiated from him despite everything he had been through. Before he could say anything, before he could close the door in my face, which would have been completely justified, I began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush of emotion and desperation. I told him I was sorry, more sorry than words could express, that I had been wrong about everything, that my treatment of him and Sarah was the greatest mistake of my life, that I knew I had no right to ask for anything from him, but I was begging for a chance to know my grandson, to be whatever small part of Danny's life he might be willing to allow. I told him I understood if he hated me, that I deserved his anger and his rejection, but that I hoped for Danny's sake he might consider letting me try to make amends. The tears I had been holding back began to fall, and I stood there on his doorstep, this man I had once deemed unworthy, completely vulnerable and at his mercy. Miguel listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when I finally ran out of words and stood there waiting for his response, the silence stretched out so long that I was sure he was about to tell me to leave and never come back. But then he did something I never expected. He stepped back and opened the door wider, gesturing for me to come inside. I entered hesitantly, not sure what this meant, whether it was an invitation to talk or simply a desire to not have this conversation on his doorstep where neighbors might see and hear. Danny looked up from his toys when I came in, studying me with that same curious expression I had seen at the cemetery, and Miguel said something to him in Spanish that I didn't understand. The boy returned to his playing, but I could feel him sneaking glances at me, clearly wondering who this old man was and why his father had let a stranger into their home. Miguel gestured to a chair, and I sat, looking around at the home Sarah had lived in, seeing evidence of her everywhere in the photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, the small decorative touches that were distinctly hers. There was a large portrait of Sarah above the fireplace, captured in a moment of pure joy, her smile radiant and her eyes sparkling with life, and seeing it made my chest constrict with fresh grief. Miguel caught me looking at it and said softly that Danny talked to his mama's picture every night before bed, telling her about his day and saying he loved her. The image of my grandson engaging in this heartbreaking ritual, trying to maintain a connection with the mother he had lost, nearly broke me. Miguel offered me coffee, and as we sat at the kitchen table, far enough from Danny that he couldn't hear our conversation, he began to speak. His English was excellent, with only a slight accent that added warmth to his words, rather than making him difficult to understand. He told me that Sarah had never stopped loving me, that she had talked about me often with a mixture of hurt and hope that someday I would change my mind and want to be part of their lives. He said she had wanted to tell me when she got pregnant, had even driven to my house twice intending to knock on my door and share the news, but had lost her courage both times, afraid of being rejected again. When Danny was born, she had cried, partly from the overwhelming emotions of becoming a mother, but also because she wished her own parents could have been there to meet their grandson. Miguel's voice was gentle as he recounted this, without accusation or anger, just stating the facts of what my stubbornness had cost us all. He told me about their life together, about how hard they had worked to build something stable and good, about Sarah's dedication to her work and her family, about the love that had sustained them through financial struggles and the challenges of raising a child. He showed me photos from their wedding, from Sarah's pregnancy, from Danny's birth and early years, images I should have been present for, moments I should have shared. In one photo, Sarah was visibly pregnant, glowing with happiness, her hand resting on her swollen belly while Miguel's arms wrapped around her from behind, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of pure contentment and love. Another showed Sarah in a hospital bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a newborn Danny while Miguel sat beside her, both parents gazing at their son with wonder and devotion. There were birthday parties and holiday celebrations, trips to the beach and the zoo, all the normal, precious moments that make up a family's history, a history I had exiled myself from. Miguel's willingness to share these photos with me, to let me see what I had missed rather than rubbing my face in it or using it as a weapon, spoke volumes about his character. He could have been cruel, could have taken satisfaction in my pain, but instead he was simply sharing the truth of the life they had built, the family I had rejected. As I looked through the photos, I noticed that in several of them, particularly from the early years, Sarah's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and Miguel confirmed what I had suspected, that she had carried the pain of our estrangement throughout her married life, that my absence had been a constant sorrow even amid her happiness. That knowledge was devastating. To know that even in her happiest moments with the family she had built, my daughter had grieved the loss of our relationship, had wished I could share in her joy. I had not only robbed myself of these years, I had stolen some of Sarah's happiness too, had cast a shadow over her life that she shouldn't have had to carry. The guilt of that realization was almost unbearable, adding another layer to the mountain of regret I was already carrying. Miguel explained that Danny knew he had a grandmother who had died before he was born, but that Sarah had never told him much about me, not wanting to burden their son with the knowledge that his grandfather had rejected his parents. He said that after Sarah died, he had debated whether to tell me about Danny, whether I had a right to know about my grandson given how I had treated Sarah. He had ultimately decided that it wasn't his place to reach out, that if I wanted to be part of Danny's life, I would have to take that step myself. The fact that months had passed before I had worked up the courage to do so had confirmed his suspicion that I was either unaware of Danny's existence or didn't care, which made my sudden appearance at his door both surprising and, he admitted, somewhat suspicious. He wanted to know what I really wanted, whether this was about assuaging my own guilt or whether I genuinely wanted to build a relationship with Danny, because he would not allow anyone to hurt his son the way Sarah had been hurt. His protectiveness was not only understandable but admirable, exactly what a good father should feel, and I respected him for it even as I struggled to prove that my intentions were genuine. I explained that I had seen them at the cemetery, that the image of Danny had haunted me every day since, that I had spent months in therapy and self-reflection, trying to understand and undo the prejudices that had led me to make such terrible choices. I told him I didn't expect forgiveness, didn't think I deserved it, but that I wanted the chance to be a grandfather to Danny, if Miguel would allow it, to try to give this child some of the love and support I should have been giving all along. I promised I would respect whatever boundaries he set, would move at whatever pace he was comfortable with, and most importantly, would never speak negatively about him to Danny or try to undermine his parenting. All I wanted was a chance, however small, to be part of my grandson's life, and to honor Sarah's memory by being the father and grandfather I should have been from the beginning. The conversation lasted for hours, with Miguel asking me hard questions about my prejudices, about what had changed, about how I could guarantee I wouldn't hurt Danny the way I had hurt Sarah. I answered as honestly as I could, not trying to make excuses or minimize what I had done, acknowledging that I had been racist, classist, and cruel in my judgment of him and my treatment of my daughter. I explained the work I had been doing to examine and change my beliefs, the education I had pursued to understand the immigration system, and the humanity of people caught in it, the way I had confronted the uncomfortable truth that I had been profoundly wrong about things I had been so certain of. Miguel listened carefully, watching my face as if trying to determine whether I was sincere or simply saying what he wanted to hear. Finally, he said he would think about it, that he needed time to process and decide what was best for Danny. but that he appreciated me coming and being honest about my failures. He stood, indicating the conversation was over, and I stood too, knowing I had to respect his need for time and space. But before I left, I asked if I could meet Danny, just briefly, if Miguel felt comfortable with that. He hesitated, clearly torn, then called Danny over. My grandson came cautiously, standing close to his father's leg, and Miguel gently told him that I was his grandpa, his mama's dad. Danny's eyes widened, and he looked up at Miguel as if checking whether this was okay, and at his father's nod, he turned back to me with renewed curiosity. I knelt down so I was at his eye level, my knees protesting but my heart soaring at finally being this close to my grandson, and I told him I was very happy to meet him, that his mama had been my daughter, and I missed her very much. Danny studied my face for a moment, then asked in his small, serious voice if I had loved his mama. The question pierced me, and I answered with absolute honesty that yes, I had loved her more than anything, even though I had made terrible mistakes that hurt her. I told him his mama had been brave and kind and wonderful, and that I could see she was still here in him. Danny seemed to accept this, and then surprised me by asking if I liked soccer, because he was really good at it, and maybe I could come watch him play sometime. The casual invitation, offered with a child's straightforward openness, made tears spring to my eyes, and I looked up at Miguel, silently asking permission. He gave a small nod, and I told Danny I would love to watch him play soccer, that nothing would make me happier. Then Danny, with the impulsive affection of a young child who had decided I was okay, wrapped his arms around my neck in a quick hug before running back to his toys, leaving me kneeling there with tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the simple gift of that embrace. Miguel walked me to the door, and before I left, he said something that has stayed with me every day since. He told me that Sarah had loved me despite everything, that she had understood I was acting out of fear even though it had hurt her deeply, and that she had always hoped I would find my way back to them. He said that for Sarah's sake, and for Danny's sake, he was willing to give me a chance to prove I had changed, but that if I ever did anything to hurt Danny or make him feel less than loved and valued, he would end whatever relationship we were building without hesitation. I understood completely and thanked him for his willingness to even consider letting me into their lives after everything I had done. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, tentative and fragile, but real. I had met my grandson, had been given a chance to begin making amends, and while I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, requiring me to prove through consistent action that I had truly changed, I was grateful for the opportunity. That night I pulled out all the photos of Sarah I had, spreading them across my dining room table, and I spoke to her as if she could hear me. I told her I was sorry, so desperately sorry for the pain I had caused, for the years we had lost, for not being the father she deserved. I promised her that I would be the grandfather Danny deserved, that I would honor her memory by loving and supporting her son the way I should have loved and supported her and Miguel. I promised I would never make the same mistakes again, that I would choose love over prejudice, acceptance over judgment, family over pride, and though I knew she couldn't answer, I felt in my heart that she heard me, that somewhere she was glad I had finally found the courage to do the right thing, even if it had come far too late for us. The following months were a careful, gradual process of building a relationship with Danny, while proving to Miguel that my change was genuine and lasting. We started slowly, with supervised visits where I would come to their house and spend an hour or two with Danny, playing games or helping with homework or listening to him chatter about his interests and his friends. Miguel was always present during these early visits, watching our interactions carefully, ready to intervene if necessary. I didn't resent this at all, understanding that he needed to protect his son and that trust had to be earned through consistent behavior over time. I showed up when I said I would, never made promises I couldn't keep, and most importantly treated Miguel with the respect and appreciation he deserved as Danny's father and as Sarah's husband. I asked him for permission before taking Danny anywhere, deferred to his parenting decisions even when I might have done things differently, and made sure Danny understood that his father was the authority and that I was simply grateful to be included in their family. Gradually, Miguel began to relax, to see that I was serious about being a positive presence in Danny's life, rather than an undermining or judgmental one. He started leaving the room during our visits, giving Danny and me time alone together, and eventually agreed to let me take Danny for outings without his supervision. The first time he handed Danny over to me for an afternoon at the park, trusting me to keep his son safe and return him on time, I felt the weight of that trust like a sacred responsibility. Danny and I went to soccer games, to the movies, to museums and parks and all the places grandparents and grandchildren go together. I learned about his love of dinosaurs and space, his fear of thunderstorms, his favorite foods, and his dreams of becoming a veterinarian so he could help animals. Every moment with him was precious, a gift I had almost lost forever through my own stubbornness and prejudice. As time passed and Danny and I grew closer, I also developed an unexpected but meaningful friendship with Miguel. We started having conversations that went beyond just coordinating visitation, actually talking about our lives, our work, our hopes for Danny's future. I learned more about his journey from Mexico, about the family he had left behind and still supported financially, about the challenges and discrimination he had faced while building his life in America, about his dreams and his fears, and his unwavering commitment to giving his son every opportunity he could. I learned that he was saving money to take Danny to Mexico someday, to meet his extended family, that he volunteered as a mentor for immigrant youth trying to navigate the system he had conquered, that he donated regularly to the nonprofit where he had met Sarah, honoring her memory by supporting the work she had loved. The more I knew him, the more I respected him, and the more ashamed I became of my initial judgment. This man had more integrity, kindness, and strength than many of the privileged professionals I had associated with throughout my career. He had loved my daughter completely, was raising their son with devotion and wisdom, and had shown me grace and forgiveness I didn't deserve. One evening after Danny had gone to bed, Miguel and I sat in his backyard, and I finally said what I had been wanting to say for months. I thanked him for being such a good husband to Sarah, for making her happy in ways I had been too blind to see, for giving her the love and support she deserved. I told him I was grateful he was Danny's father, that I couldn't imagine a better man to raise my grandson, and that I was sorry for every moment of prejudice and judgment I had shown him. Miguel was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that brought tears to my eyes. He said that Sarah had told him once that she believed someday I would come around, that the father she remembered from her childhood, the man who had held her when she cried and cheered at her achievements and told her she could do anything, was still in there somewhere beneath the fear and prejudice. She had believed I was capable of change, of growth, of love that was bigger than my biases. Miguel said he had doubted it, had thought Sarah was being too optimistic, but that watching me with Danny, seeing the effort I was making to build bridges instead of walls, had shown him that Sarah had been right about me, just as she had been right about him. Danny started calling me Grandpa naturally without prompting, and every time I heard that word from his lips, my heart swelled with joy and gratitude. I established a college fund for him, not as a way to buy his affection, but because I wanted to contribute to his future in practical ways. I attended his soccer games, cheering loudly from the sidelines, wearing ridiculous team colors and making signs with his name. I helped with school projects, took him to get ice cream after good report cards, taught him to play chess and let him beat me sometimes even though he was actually getting quite good. I was there for his 7th birthday party, watching him blow out candles surrounded by friends, and I thought about how Sarah should have been there, how she should have seen her son growing into such a wonderful child. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, the 3 of us went to the cemetery together, each bringing flowers, each dealing with our grief in our own way. Danny told his mama about school and soccer, and how Grandpa had taught him to play chess. Miguel stood with his hand on the headstone, silent tears running down his face, and I knelt beside my daughter's grave, telling her about the grandson I had finally gotten to know, promising her again that I would never make the same mistakes, that I would be the grandfather Danny deserved and the father-in-law Miguel should have had from the beginning. As we left the cemetery that day, Danny reached up and took my hand on one side and Miguel's on the other, connecting us together, and I understood that this bond we were building together in Sarah's memory was what she had wanted all along, for the people she loved to love each other. I wish I could tell you that this story has a completely happy ending, that everything was magically fixed, and we all lived without pain or regret. The truth is more complicated than that, because some losses can never be fully healed, some time can never be recovered, and some mistakes cast shadows that last a lifetime. I will never get back the years I lost with Sarah, will never be able to tell her face to face how sorry I am, We'll never see her be a mother to Danny or grow old with Miguel or achieve all the dreams she had for her life. I live every day with the knowledge that my prejudice and stubbornness cost me precious time with my daughter, cost Danny years of knowing his grandfather, cost Miguel the family support he and Sarah should have had. The guilt of that doesn't disappear just because I've built a relationship with my grandson. It remains a constant companion, a reminder of the devastating consequences of letting fear and bias control our choices. But I also live every day with gratitude for the chance I've been given, for Miguel's willingness to forgive, for Danny's open heart, for the opportunity to be part of my grandson's life, even though I don't deserve it. I've learned that prejudice isn't just an abstract political issue. It's a deeply personal force that destroys families and steals irreplaceable moments from people's lives. I've learned that the labels we put on people, the judgments we make based on their circumstances rather than their character, blind us to the humanity and worth of individuals who might enrich our lives immeasurably if we would only let them in. I've learned that pride is a poison that kills relationships slowly, that the longer you hold on to it, the more damage it does, until one day you wake up and realize you've lost everything that mattered while insisting you were right. If you're still with me after this long and painful confession, I want to ask you to do something for me, for yourself, for the people in your life who matter. I want you to examine your own prejudices, the assumptions you make about people based on where they come from or what they look like or what their circumstances are. I want you to think about whether there are relationships in your life that you're damaging or destroying because you're holding on to judgment or pride instead of choosing love and acceptance. I want you to consider whether you might be making the same mistakes I made, whether you might be pushing away people who deserve your respect and care because they don't fit into the narrow boxes you've constructed for how things should be. And if you recognize yourself in any part of my story, if you see your own stubbornness or prejudice reflected in the choices I made, I'm begging you to change course before it's too late, before you lose years or relationships that can never be recovered, before someone you love dies and leaves you with nothing but regret and what-ifs. Don't wait for a funeral to realize you were wrong. Don't wait for tragedy to show you what you had when you still had a chance to fight for it. Reach out to the people you've pushed away. Apologize for your mistakes. Do the hard work of examining and changing your beliefs. Choose love and family over pride and prejudice. I promise you it will be difficult. It will require you to admit you were wrong and confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. But I also promise you it will be worth it, that the relationships you save or repair will be more valuable than whatever pride or principles you thought you were protecting. I know this story is hard to hear. I know it's uncomfortable to sit with the reality of how much damage one person's prejudice can cause. But I'm sharing it because I don't want anyone else to make the mistakes I made, to lose the years I lost, to stand at a grave mourning not just a death but a relationship that died long before the person did. I'm sharing it because maybe, just maybe, my story can be a warning that prevents even one person from destroying their family the way I destroyed mine. Danny is 9 years old now, a smart, kind, talented child who lights up my life every time I see him. He's starting to look even more like Sarah as he gets older, developing her mannerisms and her compassionate nature, carrying forward her legacy in ways that both comfort and pain me. Miguel and I have become true friends, bonded by our shared love for Danny and for Sarah's memory, by our commitment to giving this child the best possible life, even though the woman we both loved isn't here to share it. We cook dinner together some evenings, Miguel teaching me traditional Mexican recipes while we tell Danny stories about his mother, keeping her alive in his memory. We go to parent-teacher conferences together, discuss parenting strategies, support each other through the challenges of raising a child in a complicated world. In Miguel, I found not just my daughter's husband and my grandson's father, but a truly good man who has shown me more grace and forgiveness than I ever extended to him. The irony isn't lost on me that the man I once judged as unworthy has turned out to be one of the best people I've ever known, someone I'm honored to call family and friend. But late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still weep for all that was lost, for the daughter I failed, for the years I can never get back, for the pain I caused to people who deserved only love and support. I look at my grandson and I see Sarah, and my heart breaks all over again knowing she's not here to see him grow up, to be part of his life, to see what an amazing young man he's becoming. I know that my presence in Danny's life, while meaningful, can never make up for his mother's absence, just as building a relationship with Miguel can never undo the hurt I caused Sarah. Some things, once broken, can be mended but never made whole again, and you carry the cracks forever as a reminder of your failures. If I could go back to that moment in my study when Sarah told me about Miguel, if I could whisper to that stubborn, prejudiced man I was and tell him to choose love instead of judgment, to embrace his daughter's choice instead of rejecting it, to welcome Miguel into our family instead of giving Sarah an ultimatum, I would do it in a heartbeat. But time only moves in one direction, and all we can do is try to make better choices going forward, to learn from our mistakes even when those lessons come at a devastating cost. My relationship with Danny and Miguel is one of the greatest blessings of my life, but it came at a price I would do anything to not have paid: the loss of my daughter and the years we should have had together. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't let prejudice steal your relationships. Don't wait until it's too late to realize that the labels and judgments you've placed on people are worthless compared to the love and connection you could have with them. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you experienced prejudice in your own family? Have you had to confront your own biases and change? Have you lost relationships because of stubbornness or judgment? Or have you been able to repair them before it was too late? Your stories and experiences might help someone else who's struggling with similar issues, might give them the push they need to make different choices than I did. It's so important to understand that our prejudices have real consequences, that they hurt real people including ourselves, that the principles we think we're upholding are often just fear and ignorance dressed up in prettier language. We have to do better. We have to be willing to examine our beliefs and change when we realize they're causing harm. We have to choose love and acceptance over pride and judgment. If this story has touched your heart, or made you think about your own relationships and choices, please leave a like on this video. It helps me know this content is reaching people and making a difference. And if you want to hear more real stories about family, relationships, mistakes, and redemption, please subscribe to Through My Eyes and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos. These stories matter, these lessons matter, and sharing them is how we prevent others from making the same devastating mistakes. Thank you for listening to my confession, for sitting with me through this painful journey, for being willing to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and its consequences. I hope that sharing my biggest regret, my greatest failure, my most painful loss, can somehow help prevent similar tragedies in other families. Remember, the people in your life won't be there forever. Time is precious and limited, and the relationships we destroy through our own stubbornness and prejudice can rarely be fully repaired. Choose love, choose acceptance, choose family, choose connection over pride, and do it now before it's too late, before you're standing at a grave realizing everything you threw away and can never get back.